Okay. So the second major effort of the New Deal was in the area of relief. It's the great humanitarian effort on the part of the New Deal to help those that were in need. And I suggest to you, of course, that the New Deal did provide direct relief through things like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, but was less comfortable with that than they were with work relief. So the primary idea of the New Deal was not to provide people with a handout, but provide them with a job if they possibly could. So we see the focus of their efforts in the area of work relief. And there's a bunch of these work relief agencies that Civilian Works, I can't remember all of them, Public Works Authority, there's a Civilian Works something, Anyway, I'm going to skip to the most famous and the most important of all of them. And it was something called the Works Progress Administration, better known as the WPA. It does kind of show you that it took a little while for them to get to this point, so this is not until 1935. They'd gone through some other iterations of work relief agencies, but the great work relief agency of the administration was the WPA. The WPA is one of the more famous of all the New Deal agencies because of all the things that it will ultimately do. Now, the primary idea, of course, is work relief, and at some point, in terms of the complete story, the WPA will employ about 8 million Americans. Pretty amazing when you think about it. The actual official unemployment was around 13 million, so we're taking a big chunk of those. Although I do want you guys to know that they never employed more than 3 million at a time. But if you do the span of the entire program, we're looking at 8 million people. I have to tell you that this impacts people even that I knew. My Uncle Joe, my old Uncle Joe, he was the wife of my Aunt Jen. And Joe was from a very large Roman Catholic family that grew up in Los Angeles. So his father was the father of 12 children, and his father was a carpenter. And there were many times during the 1930s when Joe's dad lost his job. And every time he lost his job, he would go to the WPA. I mean, it was sort of there to sustain it. And as soon as he got another job, of course, he would leave the WPA, but it was there to help sustain that very large family through that very difficult time as far as Los Angeles was concerned. But anyway, the WPA would ultimately employ over 8 million Americans over the course of its existence. Now, the pay is not just one form of it. There's a whole bunch, or there are a variety of kind of ways you get paid. There was a blue-collar expression of the WPA, there's a white-collar expression, there are regional differences, but I'm just going to kind of go with, here's a generic for us. Generally speaking, about $50, it says per day, doggone it, $50 a month, so they get paid $50 a month for their work in the WPA. And there was one particular important rule of thumb, and that was that only one member of a family could be employed by the WPA. And that does make sense, of course, because you've got to share the wealth as much as you can. But one end result of having only one person per family was that it primarily meant that men were being employed. The basic idea of the WPA was to employ husbands and fathers. And the idea, of course, was that you're not just giving money in the hands of one person, but an entire family. So the only women who were employed by the WPA would be single parents, single mothers. And I actually did run into one in Redlands. So there were some women who did work for the WPA, but it was primarily for men. They were the ones who were going to benefit from this. So the idea of the WPA was simply to make jobs, create jobs and have those for, like I told you, ultimately 8 million people. So the question was, what's the WPA going to do? And the answer is it was primarily going to build things. So it's primarily a construction agency designed to build the infrastructure of the United States of America. There actually has been a suggestion, of course, I remember during the Obama administration of something like this. Our infrastructure is getting old and crumbly. Well, wouldn't it be a smart thing to create an agency whose job it is both to create jobs, but also to redo the infrastructure of the United States? But, this was that big first national instance to try to build infrastructure. So what did they do? They built roads all over America. In fact, they finished up a lot of the big transnational highways. I think they did a lot of work on like Highway 395. They built airports across America. They built schools across America. When I was in El Dorado High School in Orange County, I saw that the gymnasium said WPA. They would do that. They built buildings for what would become San Bernardino Valley College. They built buildings for Chaffey College. So some of our older community colleges were built by the WPA. They built the town hall in Redlands, that's the kind of things that they would do. Lots of beautification projects. They did dams like Grand Coulee Dam, all flood control districts all across America. Big important infrastructural constructions were done by the WPA. So this is a major activity in what they would be involved in. They did a beautification project around Mount Rubidoux in Riverside, where I grew up. I remember looking and kind of messing around with all the beautification. They did a graveyard over in Redlands where my mother-in-law is buried. They did the amphitheater down there at Oceanside, by Oceanside Pier, so that was done by the WPA. So just tons of stuff. I mean, when you're looking around, if you're traveling, you see some old public buildings done in the 30s, good chance the WPA was behind that. They did sidewalks, the sidewalks that I would walk to school. I forgot about that. There was a stamp for the WPA, and of course when we walked to school there were all kind of rules. Step on a crack, you break your mother's back. Step on the line, you break your father's spine. And so I was so afraid of doing damage to my parents, I usually just walked on the grass and tried to stay off the sidewalk altogether. But anyway, the WPA was there to build a whole bunch of infrastructural components as far as the United States was concerned. Now, one thing I always like about the New Deal is they tended to go towards the creative whenever they possibly could. So we see in the WPA so much more than simply, construction projects. So here's these creative employments that they would have. There was an artist project, so they were public beautification through artistic expression. They're going to do murals in many public buildings across America, and these were these cool kind of, whenever I think of it, like Diego Rivera, so the great Mexican muralist, but something like that. A proletarian style, a muscular kind of style of people, Americans doing work, farmers and construction workers or whatever, they become cross. They did sculptures. There's one in Riverside when I grew up. It's the De Anza statue. It's a beautiful WPA statue. Very much kind of, I don't know if it's Art Deco or whatever that's proletarian style. A very buff and muscular De Anza standing kind of like this. It was got his hair in a queue coming down the back. It's sort of a Spanish conquistador look. And the statue's really cool, but they also did this arcing kind of background to it. And if you look up, they carved into stone like all of the people that, I didn't even tell you, De Anza's the person who created the first overland route from Mexico to Southern California. And so the lower part is like, they're etching the entire group of people that are coming with De Anza to kind of celebrate his particular activity. One of the more interesting WPA statues I've seen was at the Manassas Battlefield, Battle of First Bull Run. And so this is where Stonewall Jackson got his name. So where Stonewall made his stand, he refused to allow the Confederacy to retreat. So by standing there, he stood there like a Stonewall. That's how come he became known as Stonewall Jackson. They built a statue at that location. Now the statue is just kind of a crack-up because it's this massively muscular thing. And it's not just that Stonewall Jackson comes off he looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger on steroids, which of course may be what he was all the time anyway. But just really super buffed out guy with big old biceps and really cut thighs and all that kind of stuff. But the funny part to me was not so much that, that Stonewall Jackson, and by the way, he was a very thin, slight kind of guy, but not that he was so muscular, but the horse. It was the most muscular horse I've ever seen. And it creates kind of a whole new interpretation. It's not so much that Stonewall Jackson didn't want to move, but he couldn't get his damn horse to move because it was too over-muscled, basically. Anyway, these are the kind of things that would be done by the federal artist projects. They're going to employ musicians like Woody Guthrie. He's going to sing songs for them. He wrote Roll on Columbia for the WPA. There were photographers like Dorothea Lange who would be employed to kind of document and photograph the Great Depression, including her famous Madonna of the Great Depression photograph that I mentioned to you. There were filmmakers who, these guys were unemployed, and they would be employed by the WPA, and some of them made beautiful movies. Oftentimes, one was called The Plow, and the whole concept idea was just to show how to plow in a responsible kind of way, that was environmentally responsible to sustain the soil. Yet the thing got an Academy Award, for its beauty, basically. There were actors, and that was a very famous part of the whole show. A young man by the name of Orson Welles will get his start there. He kind of lied to the WPA. He told them that he was of age when he really wasn't of age, and they gave him a job directing an all-black Shakespearean troupe out of Harlem. And I guess he turned them in, to the rage of New York City. Everybody wanted to go see this all-black Shakespearean theater up in Harlem at that time. But, and many other actors would kind of get a hand up and a little bit of a help. I'd like to focus your attention on the Federal Writers Project because that's kind of served my purposes. They did a lot of things that were good for historians. They archived county holdings and things like that. Well, one thing they also did that was really cool was they wrote guidebooks to the states. And so I actually have the guidebook to the state of California. It's from the 1930s, done by the WPA. It's fun, it's old, of course. It's what you would carry with you if you traveled across the state to kind of show you where interesting things were. And of course, it's very dated today, but you can tell they did a really good job. And of course, you get to see some cool photographs from the 1930s. But the thing they did that was so cool to me is they did these things that were generically called pioneer studies. And the basic idea was to go to communities and talk to the oldest people who were there to find out what it was like, way back in Escondido, back in the 1880s or something like that. But they did this one group, and this was just an amazing part of the story. And the group that they did were African Americans, and these were the remnant, the people who were still survivors from slavery. And they interviewed them, and they came up with this massive documentation that's called the American Slave. And I'm putting my arms like this because it's volumes of these interviews that took place, and it's just such an amazing source because you're getting to hear the words from the individuals who lived through slavery, who lived through emancipation. Somewhat problematic document. It was done by white Southerners, of course, and you can imagine the black Southerners would be reluctant to tell them exactly what they thought. But I feel like a lot of the people who were interviewed in this way, they did kind of approach it from be honest. We're old. We can tell our truth without too much difficulty. So you have a lot of interesting things that go far beyond simply infrastructure construction in terms of the WPA. And I would have to argue that I think it was both very helpful as far as the general economy was concerned and individuals who needed it, and creative too, doing good things as far as the nation is concerned. It's always that kind of key element that the New Deal was often able to do, go beyond the simple, and do something even better than that if they possibly could. Now another relief agency, which became one of the more famous relief agencies in the era of the New Deal, was something called the Civilian Conservation Corps, better known as the CCC. And if I didn't tell you guys, the WPA is a course of potential identification, as is the Civilian Conservation Corps, better known as the CCC, created in 1933 as part of the 100 Days legislation. So this is another one of the things they do in that sort of flurry of enactments at the very beginning of the New Deal. Now the base concept for the CCC was that there's a problem, and the WPA was designed to employ husbands and fathers. But what happens when you have young men, young guys coming out of high school, 18 to 25 years of age, and these guys, they're not married, they're not supporting a family, but they want to work, they want a job. And from the point of view of the New Deal, they're a problem. We have to deal with these people. So the base notion of the CCC was to take these young men out of the equation and employ them. Put them in the CCC where they're not going to have a negative impact on the job markets, and they're not going to take jobs away from husbands and fathers. So the base idea, employ the young men 18 to 25. And over the course of the agency, they will employ some 3 million young men. It actually was very functional in this regard. So these guys are taken out of the larger economy, they're put into the CCC, and they're no longer going to be a burden, of course, on the economy in any kind, or be unemployed, which was just as much of a problem. Now the CCC took these young men, 3 million of them in total, and they will pay them $30 a month to work, $30 a month, which seemed much lower than $50 a month for the WPA, $30 a month for the CCC. But it's even less than that really for the individual. They're being paid $30 a month, but they only got $5 in hand, okay? And the rest of it, $25, went home to their mom and dad. So really, it's not so much for them, but it's really for their family to guarantee that their family's doing okay. Now, believe it or not, the kids who worked in the CCC, the young men, they didn't mind, right? Because they felt that they were doing something good for their family and helping them. And on top of that, their life was basically paid for by the CCC. They lived in the CCC tents, they ate food, they were uniformed. They were given everything they basically needed to survive. And you could actually have some fun on $5. You could see a movie for 10 cents, and you could have a beer for 15 and a hamburger for 15 cents. You actually could have a date, a few dates on $5 for the entire month. So we have very little complaining on the part of the actual participants in the CCC, even though technically they're working for about $5 a month. That's the way it would come up for them. Now the question, of course, is what are they going to do? And the answer, I'm sure you guys can guess. Franklin Roosevelt was indeed part of the Roosevelt family, and Roosevelt was the keen first real proponent in terms of the policy of conservation, and Franklin wanted to kind of continue in that as much as he could. So these young men were employed basically in conservation work. This was the thing that they would do. And that's going to mean a lot of different activities. It's going to mean building trails through the national forests and national parks. They do a lot of what we call the Appalachian Trail. They do a lot of the Pacific Crest Trail, especially the John Muir part in the High Sierra. They did fish hatcheries, they made campgrounds, they had built fire breaks, they fought forest fires. My best friend's dad was actually in the CCC in Southern California in the 30s, the late 30s, and he didn't like it because he spent almost his entire time fighting forest fires. These are the kind of things that they would do. But all these conservation activities. In the Great Plains, they planted over 220 million trees. In fact, they were sometimes known as FDR's tree army for all of the trees that they had planted. And the base idea was to build them in the plains to create a windbreak so that you would stop that kind of dangerous, erosive wind activity that had caused the Dust Bowl. But if you ever see an old road with a whole line of really old trees on it, that very well could have been the CCC. There's parts of 395, like up in the near the Owens Valley, where I've always wondered who planted the trees there. How did they get in that particular location? Anyway, conservation work was the primary activity of these young men. When I was this age, I would have loved to do something like this. I wanted to be out in nature in the same kind of way. I actually did volunteer work for the National Forest Service, and I helped them to build a bridge one time on a trail. One of our more little interesting things, we helped to transport the wreckage of a plane that had crashed up in the Sierra Nevada. It had crashed actually way back in the 40s, and for some reason they wanted the wreckage out of there. So my friends and I we moved this stuff, and it was like this really heavy, I don't know what you call it, part of the engine block or something like that. And the only thing we could really do is we would like shove it to the edge of a cliff and then push it over and then go down there and shove it down just to get it kind of off of the building. The most common thing I did though for the for the Forest Service, and this was done with my troop and my colleagues, was we dug outhouses. And this is something that has to be done in the National Forest, of course. They have the classic outhouse. You have the big house sitting there. I don't know if you guys know, but the only thing that's under there is a hole. And at some point, the hole gets filled. And so when it fills up, you got to move the thing. So routinely, the National Forest Service would come to us and say, if you guys want to help and volunteer, you can move outhouses. So I moved many outhouses. And what you do, of course, is you dig a new hole. And we routinely would try to dig a hole that, routinely the holes are not much bigger than we are, but they would be at least as tall as we were. So we're trying to get like a 6-foot hole, 6-foot plus hole. And I have some pictures of myself. At the end, couldn't use a shovel, we just use a can and scrape out the bottom and bring it up. The hardest part though was moving these huts, the actual outhouse itself. They were big, they were heavy, they were awkward, and we would do them kind of Egyptian style where we would push them over and put logs underneath them, lodgepole pines, relatively small logs, and then we would just push it and roll it. And the worst part was you'd push off the hole, and it was just really hard because there's the hole and it exposes the hole that's filled up with stuff, and that's really gross, of course. And plus, it's hard. You can't, you're trying to avoid, getting near that hole. And I have to admit to you that one time I was pushing super hard on the outhouse to move it, and I did actually step into the hole. I lost my balance just a little bit, and I stepped in, and I went with my right leg up to my knee, and it just kind of squelched down when it was going down. And of course, can you imagine how gross that was? And the worst thing about it was that all of my friends, they just decided I was a pariah. They wanted nothing to do with me. And I got to tell you, I was so grossed out by it that I actually chopped my leg off. I've got a good prosthetic, it works pretty well now. Just kidding. But for a while there, no one wanted to be anywhere near me, even though I did go and wash my leg and got it as clean as I possibly could. But in that time of life, I probably would have wanted to be part of the CCC. And indeed, it was a very popular and ultimately successful organization, which both employed people, of course, and did things that were good for the individual and good for the nation. That's kind of always the way that the New Deal wanted to roll. And I will tell you about the final part of our story when I come back in just a little bit.